Bassiouni, I'm looking back at 2005 when we interviewed you. It was a year to the day after the photographs were released at Abu Ghraib. You had just been ousted as the UN rapporteur, as the UN investigator in Afghanistan after you released this report that accused U.S. troops of breaking into homes, arbitrarily arresting residents and torturing detainees, estimating around 1,000 Afghans had been detained, indicating the U.S.-led forces had committed sexual abuse, beatings, torture, and use of force resulting in death. You wrote, when these forces directly engage in practices that violate international human rights and international humanitarian law, they undermine the national project of establishing a legal basis for the use of force. You had been in Afghanistan for, what, about a year. This is now more than 3 years later. Has the situation changed?
Well, I think it has slightly improved because the deployment of U.S. troops and mostly the big mistake of using private contractors and quasi-military capabilities there, which, you know, is sort of unheard of, to have private contractors act in a military capacity alongside U.S. troops and not be answerable to the U.S. commanders. So that the U.S. commanders there had no control over what these groups would do. And, you know, I'll give you an example which, again, for the viewer would be very important. A former provincial governor came to see me and said, I would like my identity to be concealed because here's what happened. I've been a provincial governor for 2.5 years. I worked very close with the U.S. military and the U.S. Special Forces. I helped establish contacts with the moderate Talibans who were willing to cooperate with the U.S. and with the Karzai government. I pointed out to the Special Forces where the more extremist Talibans were to avoid casualties to the U.S. and had an excellent rapport with the Special Forces. He's a very honest man, came from a fairly well-to-do tribe. Well, he was changed by the Karzai government, and the person who succeeded him was rather jealous of him. And the person who succeeded him was receiving payoffs, if you will, from one of the private contractors groups there. So he called them up and said, you know, the former government is really in cahoots with the bad Talibans. And so the Special Forces kidnapped the man, 5 members of his family, held them for 4 days, tortured them, sexually abused them. And it was only when the team of Special Forces that worked with the former governor discovered that, they literally had to force their way into a stronghold of the American private contractors to free the governor and his family. And the captain of the Special Forces had tears in his eyes when he told the governor how much he regretted what the private contractors did. And my understanding is that this captain finished his term and refused to re-enlist because he figured that all of the good that the Special Forces were doing was being undermined by the private contractors. So this is an example of where you have confusion when you have different missions by different groups and when you have private contractors who are not under the control of the military. The second thing is that the military at the time, that is 2004, 2005, were really very much involved in security in the police sense of the word. They had a completely different mission in the cities than they had, for example, if they were out in the field, in the mountains, where you clearly have a distinction between a civilian and a combatant. When you're in the city, it's very difficult to distinguish who's a combatant and who's a civilian. And you have to realize that the U.S. Army is composed mostly of volunteers, young people from all over America who do not necessarily have any cultural and historical understanding of what Afghanistan is all about and what the Afghani people are. So as far as they're concerned, you know, anybody who wears a turban and a beard looks fierce and maybe can be considered an enemy. So there was a lot of mistakes done because simply they didn't have the sensitivity training that they needed to. They are very young. It's a totally unknown terrain to them. I think the same thing applies in Iraq as well, and that's why there were so many mistakes done at the beginning.
Yeah, and yet you're talking about where we're headed right now in Afghanistan, following the example of Iraq. I wanted to read you a report from AP, Associated Press, saying a classified Pentagon report urges President Barack Obama to shift U.S. military strategy in Afghanistan, de-emphasizing democracy building and concentrating more on targeting Taliban and al-Qaeda sanctuaries inside Pakistan with the aid of Pakistani military forces. Your response, Professor Bassiouni?
Well, my response is that this is the position that I believe the Joint Chiefs of Staff have taken in the recent report to the President, which has not yet been released. But this is understandable. It's an understandable mission for the military. The military like to have a clear-cut mission, which is of a combat nature. They're not paramilitary, they're not police, they're not equipped to protect civilian economic development projects or, if you will, governance projects, democracy projects. That's not their task. And they want out of it, and that's understandable. But if they want out of it, then what we need to think of in connection with economic development is to build a special sort of international police force, for lack of a better term, or to simply spend what is necessary to train the Afghan police to be able to fulfill that role. The fact that we are going to have exclusively a military role to try to push the Taliban's away from attacking. You know what? The Talibans did that 5 years ago. They realized they could not defeat the American forces, so they went underground. They put their Kalashnikovs under the mattresses and they waited. A year ago, they resurfaced again. They can do the same thing. They can go back in the mountains, push the Kalashnikovs under the mattress, wait out 5 years. They have been doing that since the 1800s with any foreign and every foreign invader. So that's not the point.
Professor Bassiouni, how could it be that you have President Obama, who opposed the war in Iraq, pushing for the same model in Afghanistan for a surge, at least doubling the forces? I mean, when I asked you if the situation was the same on human rights abuses committed by U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan today, after 3 years, reading very egregious examples from your report, you said slightly. That's not very encouraging.
Well, the more U.S. troops are away from highly densely populated civilian areas, the less likely they are going to commit violations against civilians. The more they are located in mountainous terrain where they are dealing with an enemy
we have 15
or combatant
seconds.
Groups, they will be more effective. I think President Obama is trying to show his credentials as being tough, as being pro-military,
You think it's a mistake?
I think it's a mistake.
Professor Cherif Bassiouni, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of Law at DePaul University, President Emeritus of the International Human Rights Law Institute, former UN human rights investigator in Afghanistan, ousted in 2005. DemocracyNow.org, our website. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us. This